Historically, it's been a place of rest and worship, but for Jesus, it became a place of deep agony. It's a small plot of land covered by picturesque olive trees. Yet Jesus would be taken from it only hours before his death to hang on an executioner's tree for the sins of the whole world. We're talking today about the Garden of Gethsemane. Hi, I'm Dr. Daniel McCabe with Shalom Y'all Ministries. Our co-host, Adam Kime, is not with me today, and his absence is always so noticeable. But I'm talking today about one of my favorite sites in Jerusalem and one that I've never failed to visit on all of my trips to the Holy Land. But before I launch into the Garden of Gethsemane, let me first announce two upcoming trips to Israel that we'll be making, and they're both open trips. First, there's our summer trip, May 18th through 29th, 2026. We already have a few signed up for it, and if there's also interest in a spring trip, we're offering one from March 16th through 27th next year. The estimated cost of both trips should run around $4,500 each, an estimate that essentially covers all your expenses except souvenirs. We don't set trip prices artificially high. We actually adjust the trip prices according to expected expenses or how many people plan to attend in order to keep costs down for you. So if you're interested, contact us here at shalomyallministries@gmail.com. That's SHALOMYALLMINISTRIES@gmail.com. So no spaces, no apostrophes. shalomyallministries@gmail.com if you're interested. And we'll send you some more information. Okay, time now for a quick trivia question as well. I've always liked this part of our podcast. I love stumping Adam when he's here, but it's hard to do. He's pretty knowledgeable on the land of Israel, all things Israel, but it's been a traditional way we've opened up our podcast since the very beginning. And so let's try it once again, even though I'm by myself. You probably know that there are three predominant faiths in the land of Israel. There's Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. This question's about the latter of the three. So here we go. What day do Muslims gather for worship with others? Is it Friday, Saturday, Sunday, or they don't really have a special day of worship? What day do Muslims gather for worship with others? Friday, Saturday, Sunday, or they don't really have a special day of worship? Think about that one, and we'll have the answer for you later in the podcast. Well, as I said, today's topic is the Garden of Gethsemane. We're going to take up three voices. I guess I'll use that expression to teach us about the garden. There's going to be the voice of the Bible and then the voice of history. And even the trees inside the garden will tell part of the story. The Garden of Gethsemane is at the base of the Mount of Olives. So, although the only major story in the Bible related to Gethsemane is that story about Jesus praying before he's taken into custody by Roman and Jewish authorities just hours before his execution, but there are so many stories related to the Mount of Olives. There's prophecies of coming judgment and, of course, the return of Jesus that you can read about in Zechariah 14 and some of the other Old Testament prophets. Even in Matthew 24:25, Mark 13, Luke 21, Jesus will teach about the end times that will relate to the Mount of Olives. And then, of course, the ascension of Jesus takes place, according to Acts 1, there on the Mount of Olives as well. So, although there are a lot of historical events, again, Gethsemane, the Garden of Gethsemane, is only mentioned in relation to the last hours of Jesus's life. It's actually a Very beautiful location even today. It's not really been affected all that much by commercialism. Yeah, there's a little place where you can buy some snacks and there's some taxis stationed nearby. But for the most part, the area that's traditionally thought of as Garden of Gethsemane is protected within the compound of a church called the Church of All Nations, which we'll get into here shortly. So it's stayed very pretty, and you must make a visit there when you come to the Holy Land. As I said, I've never missed out on an opportunity to go. Of course, there are hours where the church is open, and you'll want to try to avoid those. I think typically it's closed between around noon and 2 o'clock, but in the morning and in the middle to late afternoon, you can certainly stop by. And it's free of charge, and you can stop by the garden as well as the church. And again, I'll talk about those in a minute. But the story of the last hours of Jesus is recorded in the Gospels. Of course, we know from Luke 22 and other passages that the disciples on the eve of Passover find an upper room where they can share the Passover with Jesus. And when you go to John chapter 18, and I'm looking here in my Bible, in John 18, 1 and 2, it says that when Jesus had spoken these words, and John 17 is a lengthy but beautiful prayer that we've studied in the past on this podcast and in many posts that we've included on our website, and we have on Facebook. But it says that when Jesus had spoken these words, his prayer, he went out with his disciples over the brook Kidron, where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered, and Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. So it's a place that he'd been there many times, evidently. Scripture says it pretty straightforward. And so there would have been a lot of people who would have known that Jesus spent time there. Many people, therefore, even after the death of Christ and his departure through his ascension back to heaven, following his resurrection from the dead, they would have known that place. And very early on, we hear stories of the Jewish community. The early Christians were predominantly Jewish, and then even later Gentile Christians worshiping at this spot. The Bible here again in John 18 calls it a garden, but you can also turn over to Mark 14, verses 26 and 32, where it will actually call it by its name, the Garden of Gethsemane. Gethsemane meaning an olive press. That part of the base of the Mount of Olives is full of olive trees, or at least once was, and it's being restored slowly. But it was a place where Jesus could go and he could find a time to get away from the hustle and bustle of the city life, because it's right across, as it said here in John 18:1 again, it's right across the brook Kidron, or the valley of Kidron. So when you're standing on the Temple Mount, which is the site of Herod's temple and where Jesus would have been many times teaching, and many of the stories in the Gospels take place there on the Temple Mount, you can stand there and you can look directly across the valley at the base of the Mount of Olives, which rises a couple hundred feet above you, and your eyes would be directly focused on the spot that has been recognized as the Garden of Gethsemane. And so, as I said, Jesus would spend time in the busy city, and then he would slip out one of the eastern gates of the city, or maybe even the eastern gate of the temple, and make his way down into the Kidron, and then right back up to the Garden of Gethsemane. And so the Bible describes it on this agonizing night as a place where he knew clearly from the story that his life was in danger. And so he turned to prayer. If you think about it, he could have easily escaped the coming crucifixion that he knew was of course, waiting him just within the wee hours. He knew Judas would be soon there to betray him. He knew all of that, and he could have escaped. He could have slipped up the mountain. It probably would have been a brisk 10-minute walk to the peak of the Mount of Olives, and then quickly down the other side. He could have grabbed some things from Bethany and from Lazarus and Mary and Martha's home where he stayed most of the time, grabbed some supplies and off into the desert, and he would have been gone. And nobody would have been able to find him, and he would escape the cross. But that's not what he knew to be the Father's will. And he knew that by obedience, by his heart of determination to do what is necessary and needful for all of mankind, he knew he being sent by the Father, that man desperately needed this solution, the only solution, the perfect to die in place. As Romans 5:8 says, God demonstrated his love for us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And so, despite the agony which is described in these gospel accounts, he faced the cross for us. And so, the account of the garden is minimally described in the gospel accounts. It doesn't tell us a great deal about the garden, but the voice of the Bible still makes it clear that he would have been there. And so many people, as I said before, would have known the location. It would have certainly have been easy to hear from those disciples, particularly John himself, who's writing here the account of the garden, who lived to be most likely into an elderly man and perhaps dying as late as 90 to 95 AD. And by the time we get to the time of Constantine, just a couple hundred years later, when churches would be built on the Mount of Olives, and so many of the first major church buildings were erected, there would have been many people who had gathered at these spots, the spot where Jesus prayed, the spot where they believed that the disciples fell asleep just a little bit to the north of this traditional location in a place called the Cave of Gethsemane, and you can visit that as well. But there would be people who would have known it, and so they preserved this spot. Something what we know too as well from the second voice, the voice of history and archaeology. One of the things you learn very quickly in archaeology is that when you find sites, churches, buildings erected one after another on top of each other through the centuries and even through the millennium, that's usually a place where there has been a long standing tradition that is based in fact. And so, what we're going to learn very quickly as you begin to examine the archaeology that's related to this particular area is that there are evidence of churches that have been built on this site, and they go way back. The first church building that was placed on this same site that you can go to today, the site on which the Church of All Nations, the modern building, is erected. But the very first church was a Byzantine church, meaning that it went back to the 4th century AD, which is the 300s. It was probably erected during the time of Emperor Theodosius, maybe around 380, 385 AD. We're not exactly sure. We know from pilgrim accounts that it was called the Church of the Agony. And that's obviously a very fitting description given the agony that Jesus experienced there as he was facing the difficult thought of having to suffer as he would. It was also sometimes called the Church of Gethsemane, a more simplified name. But we know from pilgrim accounts as early as shortly after the erection of the church. One in particular, one pilgrim named Egeria, she was from western provinces of Roman Empire. We're not exactly sure, but she called it, quote, the elegant church in her diary, in her travel accounts. She visited this site and many other sites. But what a beautiful expression, the elegant church. And so many of these early churches, although they obviously exist now only in ruins and rubble, we do have some descriptions of them in pilgrim accounts. But it again was built on the same site. Here's the layers beginning. First, the Jerusalem community commemorated the prayer of Jesus at the spot, and then a church was built on that same spot in the late fourth century. And then we find a monk and bishop, another pilgrim. His name is Willibald, around 724 to 725. He appears to be the last pilgrim to mention the church. It may have been substantially damaged, or even some people believe uh, significantly damaged or even destroyed during the Persian invasion of 614. But those who sort of accept the idea that it survived that period or was renovated or refurbished after any destruction that may have taken place under that Persian invasion of 614, believe that it lasted to uh, the the late 700s, or maybe I should say the mid 700s, around 747. It appears to have still existed, but at that particular point, it was finally or initially destroyed by an earthquake. So the historical accounts differ a little bit, but nevertheless, it lasted at least 250 years or so in its original condition, the elegant church. And then the Crusaders came along much later in the 12th century. They rebuilt a church on that site. First of all, they put up a chapel on the same foundations of the Byzantine church. The Byzantine church had three apses in front of the church that they had built, and the Crusaders, they initially again built a chapel, but then later they built a full church. And just like the Byzantine church had three apses, they built three apses into their church. They changed the orientation a little bit of the church, and I'll explain that here in a second. But the three apses of both of these churches seem to have been commemorating the three specific prayers of Jesus in the garden. He would go back to the disciples and say, "Why are you sleeping?" and then go back to prayer. And so they built the churches with that in mind. I mentioned that the Crusader church had been moved a little bit off the axis of the Byzantine church because the Byzantine church was built around a large piece of bedrock that they assumed was the rock on which Jesus prayed in the garden. And so the Crusaders, in building their church, they changed that orientation to take in a little bit more area of that bedrock, and so that the bedrock would show up in each of the three apses of the church. I don't think, from what I'm reading in history, that the church was ever fully completed, and it was abandoned after Saladin's conquest in 1187 and fell into ruin. But uh, one of my favorite writers, who's written a tremendous archaeological travel guide to the Holy Land, Murphy O'Connor, Jerome Murphy O'Connor, says that it still functioned as late as 1323 until it was abandoned in 1345. So it's always a little bit hard sometimes to get the historical accounts of the destruction of these churches to agree entirely. The phases of destruction may have taken place, and so each account may emphasize a different phase of its usage and final destruction. But again, we see the Jewish community, the early Christians, gathering there for worship, and then the Byzantines build a church. Then the Crusaders come along and build on top of that a chapel, and then later the church. But for many, many years, for really hundreds of years, until the church that's standing there today was erected built between 1919 and then completed in 1924. It laid abandoned. But the modern church, the Church of All Nations, it was uh, financed by contributions from many countries, and so therefore called the Church of All Nations. And it stands directly atop portions of the Byzantine and the Crusader foundations. And the modern church, again, is what has kept the garden site today very well maintained because it's within the walled courtyard of the church, and they're very gracious to open it up for tourists, and you don't have to pay anything to get in there. But it's a way that the Franciscans there, who are in custody of the church and that area, again, the Garden of Gethsemane, they are preserving it. And it's beautifully preserved, by the way. I've taken some pictures there. I'm not even a great photograph or photographer, but I've taken some pictures there that are just stunning. You can't hardly take a bad picture there in the Garden of Gethsemane. You can walk around the trees. They have essentially built a walkway around all the trees, but you can't walk up to them. They're protecting them that way so people don't damage them. But it's nonetheless incredibly close to your view, and so you can get some really good pictures of the trees. I've mentioned to people in the past that when you're on the south side of the walkway around the trees there in the courtyard, be sure to look up because you can see above the wall. And if you're looking up, because you're at the base of the mountain, if you look up, you can see beyond the wall to your west across the valley of Kidron. You can see just a tiny bit of the dome of the rock, the shrine that stands upon the traditional spot of where King Herod's temple was built. You can still see that off in the distance. That makes a beautiful photograph for you. But um, the third voice, we mentioned the biblical voice. I've shared a couple of scriptures, and then the historical and archaeology voice. But there's one more voice that speaks quite loudly on the site, and it's the trees. There's many ancient olive trees within this garden compound. People often ask me, well, how old are these trees? Do they go back to the time of Jesus? And it's difficult to know exactly how old they are, in part because olive trees, they don't have rings that tell their age. And so we can't know for sure. Many of them have been dated and they show dating no earlier than 1100 AD, but their root systems could very well date back to the time of Jesus because olive trees can regenerate from ancient roots. There are 8 very old olive trees in the garden. They have grayish bark and twisted, mangled trunks that I think are part of the mystery and beauty of ancient olive trees. The biggest one is almost 5 feet in diameter and 26 feet tall, which is very large for an olive tree. And again, do they go back to the time of Jesus? Probably not. And usually the reason for that is given, well, we obviously don't know, but we refer to commonly to the writings of Josephus, a first century historian who, in his chronicle of the wars of the Jews, he writes the following line that speaks volumes. He says, so the trees, describing the siege now of Rome, around Jerusalem in 70 AD, and he says, now the trees were cut down immediately as they began their siege. They were going to use them for defensive purposes and for structural purposes. So again, he writes, the trees were now cut down immediately, and then this phrase, and the suburbs left naked. So it's these two small expressions that lead historians and biblicists to conclude that most likely they were all cut down by the Romans for the purposes I've just mentioned. And again, the dating doesn't seem to go back beyond the medieval times, 1100 AD. So probably not original, but nonetheless, they kind of capture very well the place where Jesus would have prayed. It's also a place where you can see other sites like cypress trees are there, and rose bushes, and there's lavender and geraniums, marigold, ivy. There's probably more than that that I can even think of, but it's just beautiful, stunning. And then you can step into the church. The courtyard is open air, but then you can go to the east of the courtyard, and there's a little um, opening, a front door of the church that you can step into, and you can walk up and you can see the bedrock that's there. And perhaps this is where Jesus prayed. Once again, we don't know for sure, but it captures at least the image of that. And I always tell people, if you want to try to picture what it was like in Jesus's day, or any site, not just Gethsemane, but other sites, just try to remove the church. I know it's well-meaning to try to capture that spot as a place of worship, and I respect that. But try to remove the church from your mind, and feel what it would have looked like in Jesus's day, and then you can see the bedrock, perhaps, in a better understanding, better sight, better sense of what it would have looked like if you can rebuild around the rock. Olive trees that obviously are no longer there because of the building and construction, but just plant some trees there around the bedrock, and it could very well have been the site. And again, wherever you see stacks of archaeology built on one another, it's a very, very good sign that something significant took place there. And you can't know the place often for sure, but we remember the person of Jesus, and we can reflect upon his pain, but his pain was rooted in his love for us, and that he was determined to face the pain for us, to die for us in our place. And you can find time in a quiet corner of the courtyard, perhaps, although it's fairly bustling most of the time, but you can find a little place or inside the church where you can kneel and just pray yourself and remember what Jesus has done for you. When you go, don't miss stopping by the Garden of Gethsemane. And when you when you go, don't forget to look up to the top of the Mount of Olives above you, and remember that one day Jesus Christ will return on top of the Mount of Olives just as he left. And what a sight that will be. Well, let's return now to our trivia. And I asked you earlier, what day do Muslims gather for worship with others? And I gave the dates chronologically, but also alphabetically, which I tend to do so that nobody can predict what I'm thinking, or I might not want to uh, show my hand in the answers. But the 3 days are Friday, Saturday, Sunday, or the Muslims don't have a special day. Well, they do have a special day, and that day is Friday. Of course, the uh, Christian sites throughout the land of Israel, in particular in Jerusalem, I guess, they're closed to tourists on Sunday. Jewish sites are closed on Saturday. And then many Muslim sites are not as accessible on Friday, but the Muslims tend to go to services in the morning and then open up their businesses much quicker than Christians would, or Jews would, on their holy days. And so you have to be a little bit creative when you plan an itinerary in Israel. And it can be a little tricky trying to work around the days of worship of each of these three faiths. And I kind of have to work hard to do that myself when I plan trips to the Holy Land. But I sure hope you can come to Israel with us one day. Again, if you're interested in a March trip, I'd love to see that one develop. I know the May trip is almost certainly going to go. So hopefully you can join me on our May 18th through 29th trip, or March 16th through the 27th, again, if there is interest. And I hope that Adam will be back with us next time. But until then, shalom, y'all.